All right. Hello, everyone. I'm sure this is your first webinar of the week, right? Wave if you can see, if you can make sure you hear me. I want to make sure my microphone's working. Excellent. Yay, thank you. I see a lot of familiar faces, and I'm really glad you're joining us. So thanks for joining us. Welcome to While No One Was Watching from the Earth Institute of Columbia University in partnership with the Society of Environmental Journalists. I'm Dale Willman, joining you from the North Country of upstate New York. I'm a longtime radio reporter and photojournalist. I spent many years in Washington, D.C. working for NPR, CBS, and CNN. I recently spent a year in South Sudan working with radio journalists there. For decades, I've also traveled around the world to teach journalists how to better inform their communities about significant issues, and there's no more important time for that than now. Today, we're looking at the unprecedented efforts of the Trump administration to alter how the country regulates and protects the environment. We have a great panel for our discussion, and it will be a discussion. There will be no PowerPoints today. And as you will see from today's speakers who I'll introduce in just a moment, this discussion is not a debate. We do not have a representative from the administration to defend their actions. If there is interest in such a program, especially among SEJ members, we will produce one at a later date. Today's goal, though, is to provide fact-based background information about the shift in environmental regulations over the past 3+ years. I'll introduce our guests in a moment, but first to the matter of questions. You may have noticed that the chat function has been disabled. Our format is a conversation with legal experts, but you'll likely have questions for them, and here's how we're going to handle that. So get a piece of paper, if you would, to write down two things, a web address and your access number. So we're using something called onlinequestions.org. So you'll need to go to onlinequestions.org. And now the code that you're going to need, it's the event number, it's 200514. 200514. I'll try and mention that again later on in the program, but enter that into the event number and that will get you into the questions queue. Now the reason we're doing that, there are many, but as you know, on platforms like Zoom and Skype, the questions just scroll by and it's hard for a moderator to keep track of them. With onlinequestions.org, you can go and you don't necessarily have to ask a question. If you see one that you're interested in having answered, you like that. And what happens are those that are liked rise to the top of the queue. And it's a much easier way to see the questions that are of the most interest of those who are watching. What I would ask, though, this is a conversation primarily for journalists, so it's an honor system. If you would put journalists as the first word before you write your question, and those are the ones that will get priority. So try and remember to do that if you would. Now, if you'll please allow me to introduce our guests. Michael Berger is the Executive Director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia University. His research focuses on legal strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and promote climate change adaptation. Ann Carlson serves as faculty co-director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the UCLA School of Law. She's a leading scholar of climate change and air pollution law and policy. James McElfish is a senior attorney with the Environmental Law Institute, and he's the director of their Sustainable Use of Land program. His work also includes research on renewable energy, siting, coastal zone activities, and much more. Later this hour, we'll be joined by Emily Gertz. Emily is a veteran environmental journalist and a board member of the Society of Environmental Journalists. She is also senior editor at the online publication, Drilled News. So recently, there's been a quiet shift away from enforcement of federal environmental laws, and that has occurred during the pandemic while everyone's attention is focused elsewhere. We're going to get to that and build up to that, but for journalists who may not normally cover this issue completely, it's important that we start at the beginning. So Michael, if I could start with you. Trump was pretty clear about his intentions quite early on, even in the campaign, wasn't he?
Absolutely. Donald Trump ran on a platform of climate denial and with a number of pledges to withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement and to counteract the Clean Power Plan and to roll back climate regulations across the board, as well as a more generally anti-environmental set of commitments.
Sorry, go ahead. Okay, so sorry, you go ahead.
Still getting a hang of this Zoom thing, and
oh yeah, we never will.
Yeah, that come here. But please go on with your question.
Now, I was just going to say, so if we could, Anne, do you have something to add to that, or Jim, or do you want to, what I want to do is go from this was something that he was always very upfront about, and this administration has always been clear about, and what's progressed over the last 3.5 years.
Yeah.
Sure. What? Sorry, go ahead, Michael.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, it's helpful to start off, I guess, with a recognition of what the state of play was back in 2016, and what was on the board in terms of climate regulations. The Obama administration, in its second term in particular, had really amped up and ramped up its ambition in regulating greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act. So there were regulations that were final or near final for motor vehicles, transportation fuels, new and existing power plants, the oil and gas sector, municipal landfills. There was progress towards regulating greenhouse gas emissions in the aviation and shipping sectors. There was maybe some very early activity in looking at various industrial sectors, which eventually will have to be regulated under the Clean Air Act as well. There was a regulatory system put in place to reduce HFCs under the SNAP program. And all of this regulation under the Clean Air Act was intended to be an essential part of the nation's overall response to climate change. The emissions reductions that were achievable under the regulations that were in place at that time were not enough to satisfy the ambition reflected in the Paris Agreement, but they were an on-ramp to that eventual goal and towards the deep decarbonization that is ultimately required to address the climate crisis. And so the Obama administration's actions under the Clean Air Act and its engagement and its leadership in the forging the consensus necessary to achieve the Paris Agreement, and then its engagement with negotiations to form the rule book for the Paris Agreement and the commitment that was reflected in the idea that the US would ultimately implement those commitments was all part of a comprehensive, emerging executive branch approach to taking on the climate crisis. And it wasn't just limited to the Clean Air Act either. There was guidance for how to treat climate change under the National Environmental Policy Act. So how to deal with climate change in the context of environmental reviews. In public lands management, the administration had imposed a moratorium on the federal coal leasing program and initiated the programmatic environmental impact statement process in order to understand the ways in which leasing coal on federal lands contributes to climate change. There was the designation of national monuments, including setting large areas in the Atlantic and Arctic off limits to oil and gas drilling. There were energy efficiency initiatives being run through the Department of Energy to issue new standards for various commercial and residential appliances. And even more generally than all of this was this, I think, commitment to mainstreaming climate change through the federal government. And so this means both climate change mitigation, reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, but then also how to respond to inevitable, already occurring, and future climate change impacts. Everything from increasing flood standards to understanding the impact of highway projects on climate change and the potential impact of climate change on highway projects, so forth and so on across the board. The administration was really seeking to mainstream climate change in federal action. And then there's, I know there's more specifics in each of those, including the clean cars. But that was sort of the state of play that I think it's useful to have in mind as we think about what's changed in the last 3.5 years and what's going on now.
Anne, did you have something you wanted to add in on that?
Yes. So I wanted to emphasize that the Trump campaign in 2016 wasn't all about climate. In fact, there was a sort of counter narrative that came and went. It wasn't always emphasized, but that you might recall, Trump routinely said that what he wanted was the cleanest air and the cleanest water, and also wanted to devolve power back to the states. And so I think when we talk about what's happened in the subsequent 3 years, it's important to keep that in mind. We still see Andrew Wheeler out trumpeting the idea that we have cleaner air than ever before, something that's not true, cleaner water than ever before, at the same time that there are water protections being rolled back. And even climate was a little bit up in the air in terms of what the Trump administration was going to do. There was a big internal battle between the Jared Kushner, I'm trying to think of their name, Javanka wing of the Trump family, and people like Myron Abell, the head of the Competitive Enterprise Institute, about whether the U.S. would remain in Paris. It was still up in the air, and it was still a moment of tension before Trump announced that he would withdraw from Paris. And so he was clearly campaigning to save coal. That was another important, I think, underlying kind of message that he was getting across, one that I think was frankly effective, even though the coal industry has not been revived under the Trump administration. So there were some themes that went beyond just anti-climate and climate denialism that I think it's important to keep in mind when we're weighing what has actually happened in the subsequent years.
All right, so you've set this up well. Jim, I don't know if you want to jump in on this, but the idea of permanence. So the idea of how these regulations are promulgated, how executive orders take place, what is the role in being able to turn things back? I think that there was surprise early on at the speed with which this administration began to attack is perhaps too strong a word, but to begin to redefine what environmental protections mean under this administration. So why was it possible to make so many changes so quickly? Jim, can you respond to that?
So I'm thinking a couple of things went on early. I think the Trump administration has made use of executive orders in the environmental sector in a much more public and aggressive way than we have seen under previous administrations. And they fall into two kinds of buckets. There's a set of executive orders that did things like put in motion deregulatory actions. One of the first orders was a repeal 2 regulations for every one you adopt, setting a regulatory budget for each agency where you had to offset or more than offset regulatory costs, such that in the coming year, EPA's regulatory budget is negative $40 billion. So they have to achieve, their target is to achieve $40 billion in cost savings by deregulation as a net over and above any additional costs they may impose. So there's this sort of regulatory reformation thing going on. And then there are this set of public executive orders that say, we're going to roll back the definition of waters of the United States, and we're going to adopt Justice Scalia's view of what are regulated as waters of the United States. We're going to launch measures that will require the rewrite of the NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, regulations. The study and revision and review of national monuments that were prescribed by presidents going back 20 years. So the two buckets are regulatory reform, revision kinds of orders, and then orders that are directed at specific natural resource or regulatory outcomes. And there are a lot of them. And what I think is interesting at this point is it's not the orders that matter so much as what's happening in the agencies that are carrying these out and how far along they are in cementing into regulation those policy priorities that were set out largely in the first 6 months of the Trump administration.
And Michael, anything to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to say a little bit about your question about speed. So it is true that the Trump administration came out with, guns ablazing to roll back a lot of rules. They also got slapped down a lot by courts for failing to follow proper procedures, failing to follow things like basic notice and comment, et cetera. And so they racked up a huge number of early losses in their efforts to roll back some of these rules. And now I think what we're going to be seeing, and the big question that I think really remains is, to what degree are courts going to let them get away with some of the substantive changes that they're trying to make? The battles have now shifted from what were relatively straightforward questions. Did you provide adequate notice? Did you use the proper procedures when you actually tried to repeal a rule? Those were quick and pretty straightforward. Now we've got very long, complex questions that are particularly going to be focused in the DC Circuit Court of Appeal, especially on some of the climate rules that Michael talked about early on. And some of those may not be resolved by the time of the election. And so one big question, I think, will be whether any of these rollbacks actually take place or new rules actually get put into place if Trump is not reelected in November. So it's true that they acted speedily. It's also true that the wheels of justice move and roll very, very slowly. And so many of these rollbacks are not actually in place yet. And it remains to be seen whether they'll actually take effect.
There is Michael, were you jumping in?
Yeah, I just to, I couldn't agree more with Jim and Anne's comments. I guess I would also add, I think that another frame that I sometimes have in mind when I'm thinking about not just the speed, but the orientation of the administration, these executive orders and then the implementation of the executive orders through the agencies. On the one hand, these are just a reflection of executive preferences and policy preferences of an incoming administration. And you do see a swing back and forth in terms of the level of environmental protection from administration to administration, and certainly from one party's term to another party's term. And we've seen that for half a century or more. I don't know that we've seen anything quite as violent as this particular swing, although some people might argue that it was pretty extreme when Reagan came in as well, or the second Bush administration. But I also think that what we're seeing here is beyond those policy preferences within an acceptable realm of executive authority. And what we're really seeing is an attempt to, in many respects, disregard congressional intent and disregard the purpose, the meaning, and the commands of legislation that was enacted by Congress in order to provide public benefits to the American people in the form of environmental protections. And so those procedural violations are part of that. The administrative state and the environmental regulations gain legitimacy by virtue of the process. And so if you undermine the process, you ignore the process, you undermine and ignore the legitimacy of those regulations. But another way of undermining the legitimacy of environmental regulation, and really, you remember when Trump came in and Stephen Bannon was at the helm, there was this commitment to deconstructing the administrative state. And I do think it's worth thinking of all of this activity as part and parcel of that larger commitment and that larger activity. Ignoring congressional commands and purposes is consistent with a form of undermining the basic legitimacy of the administrative state. The president and their agencies enact regulations that are fundamentally inconsistent with the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, and fail to fulfill those purposes and are able to get away with it, then I think we'll have a long-term problem as opposed to a short-term problem.
And it's interesting. I'm sorry, yeah, please.
Just one more thing. In addition to what Michael just said, I think the assault on expertise and scientific integrity is a really important theme that we can return to when we talk about specific proposals. But there are these broader efforts to disallow the consideration of certain expertise if it's under the guise of transparency, disregard of agency expertise, for example, in the rollback of the car standards. So we see that throughout the attempt to undermine traditional, widely accepted methodologies for cost-benefit analysis, et cetera. So this is another theme, I think, that runs through that's important. And if that succeeds, as Michael just suggested, I think we've got really serious long-term problems that aren't just immediately remediable with a new administration.
And I think, in fact, the Sabin Center, I think, has a tracker of those sorts of assaults on science. Is that not correct, Michael?
Yes, we've launched a number of trackers to keep tabs on what's going on with this administration, and the Silencing Science tracker, which we developed and maintained together with the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund, is one of them.
And I should have mentioned at the top that this will be recorded, and there will be a blog post within the next couple of days on the Earth Institute's blog, State of the Planet. And there will be a list of resources for journalists on that blog post contained in there. And there are a number of these trackers. We've got a lot of good information that will help you expand your understanding of these issues too, if needed. So, I mean, to be clear in what you were saying, Michael and Anna, what both you were saying about this, the significance of this isn't changed. The significance is the scale. But in the past, presidents would come in and it seemed like it was more of a shift in priorities and focus, whereas this appears to be a much more frontal assault on regulation in general. Is that a fair assessment of a summation of what you're saying?
I think it is for me, although I don't think we should underestimate how profound the attacks on agency expertise and so forth were during the Ann Gorsuch years in the EPA. You know, sometimes I think we forget that this is part of a longer history. But I do think that the systematic efforts across virtually every environmental statute, the attacks on science, the undermining of expertise, feels orders of magnitude different, but it might be because I was, you know, in my 20s when Reagan was president. It was a long time ago, but I do think this is orders of magnitude different than the previous two Bush administrations. It's a difference in kind, really, and scale, and you know, sort of any word you want to choose. It's just a fundamental assault, I think, on, you know, statute after statute, regulation after regulation, expertise, science, et cetera.
Well, in fact, the New York Times had an article recently where they listed 100 regulations and their status. I think 9 of them they said were finalized. The rest were either finalized and in litigation or were in process. But that number actually seemed low to me. And I could be totally misled here, but it seems like the number is higher than that. And I don't know if any of you have a handle on that overall, if my perception is accurate or not.
So it depends how you count it. The New York Times published, I think it was 95 the last time I had looked, environmental and natural resource rollbacks of one type or another. And these good trackers that NYU and Columbia, the Sabin Center, and others have done sometimes count these differently because some of these rollbacks or changes are phased. And so if you are purporting to suspend a rule or defer its effective date or propose a replacement, is that one action or 3 actions? So it's easily more than 100 moves across the board of natural resources, ranging from oceans to the ways in which states and the federal government relate under the Clean Water Act, to things dealing with how we permit pipelines. And then that's not even to mention the federal regulatory agencies. FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has issued some very consequential orders recently, which can make it extremely difficult for states to meet their renewable energy goals. Now, is that a tracked, Trump administration regulatory rollback? Not exactly, but it's part and parcel of the kinds of efforts that are underway. So there are many to keep track of, and I would agree with Ann. I was around as a young lawyer in the transition from Carter to Reagan, and this seems different in scale or speed, but those were very consequential at the time. The one other difference is the concern with the courts. And I think there's a great deal of anticipation with this administration that the courts will sustain the activities that they have in mind. And there's a lot of consideration of how much deference federal agencies will get and should get that we may talk about.
Okay, can we? I want to ask all three of you to keep in mind, since this is a webinar specifically for journalists, if you see entry points for journalists that are particular things that you think are being underreported, underrepresented, not discussed, if you see some entries for journalists who might be looking for stories, let's throw those out too. But I'd love to talk briefly about who is challenging these changes, because I think there might be a perception that it's the usual suspects. It's the green groups, it's the NRDC, it's all the groups that usually address these things. But it's more than that. The National League of Cities, the U.S. Conference of Mayors have joined in the lawsuit with cities and counties against I forget some of the clean air stuff, I believe. So it seems to be a much broader group of people who are pushing back on this. Is that seem accurate?
Well, I think that yes and no. I think that there is a broader coalition that both in terms of litigation, and then more particularly in terms of the politics around environmental and climate action than previously. I actually wrote the brief for the National League of Cities and the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and I've been working with those associations. The first time we filed an amicus brief was in support of the Clean Power Plan, actually, back in 2016. Cities, I think that cities have been, and that was as amicus, not as a party, but cities have been involved in climate litigation from the outset. I was a lawyer for New York City back in 2003 and 2005 when Mass versus EPA was filed, and New York City was a party to that action, and other cities, Chicago and Philadelphia, Washington D.C., Los Angeles, other cities have had various roles in the litigation over the years. I think that we are really looking at the same primary actors in the courts, which are the states and state attorneys general, who are taking a very active leadership role in pushing back against the administration, the California AG, of course, as well as New York and other places. Cities are also involved in those coalitions of states, and then you do have the big green groups. I think one constituency that you're seeing a bit more of are pro-science groups and pro-scientist groups, Physicians for Social Responsibility, Union of Concerned Scientists, others who have been around, the American Lung Association. These sort of science-oriented and medical professional groups are also very actively engaged in pushing back against both the environmental and climate rollbacks, but then also the attempt to sideline scientific expertise and scientists themselves.
Yeah, I just wanted to focus a bit on the scientists, not just the advocacy organizations for scientists, but for example, there are hydrologists who are involved in a number of the water cases. We have grid experts involved in the Clean Power Plan. So I do think scientists are figuring out the role they need to be playing in some of these efforts, and working closely with lawyers. I think it's an important and kind of interesting twist that might go unnoticed if you're talking about sort of smaller journalistic stories that are nevertheless interesting. I think another place that has been really interesting to watch is the role of economists in shredding the efforts by the Trump administration to freeze the auto standards. They went through the administrative record and just destroyed the economic basis that the Trump administration was trying to use to freeze the auto standards. I can say more if you want the technical details on that, but that has been, I think, an interesting move to watch. Is that it is typical groups. It's the states, it's cities, it's NGOs that represent environmental groups, but I think that very sophisticated expertise has been deployed from a bunch of different disciplines to undermine baseless, or at least not very well supported, arguments that the Trump administration is making. Let me just say one more thing about states. One thing that I follow the auto rollback really carefully, not surprisingly, since I'm in the great state of California, whose authority has been attacked by the Trump administration. And one thing that I think that California has succeeded in doing is actually expanding the list of states, or traditional suspect states, to include a number of red states who are concerned about attacks on state power. And so the Trump administration, as you probably know, has revoked California's waiver to issue greenhouse gas emission standards, but also zero emission vehicle standards for that attack both air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. And they got something like 25 or 28 states submitting a letter opposing that. Typically, you see, I always say it's the electoral college map often tracks what the litigation kind of division is in states challenging environmental regulations. But I think that's been upended a little bit, particularly in these attacks on state power, as opposed to just the substantive environmental question that's at stake.
All right, I'm going to bring Emily in just a minute. I want to bring this up to the current state standing now. Let's talk about pandemic. What's the big thing that's happened with the pandemic and the quiet removal of enforcement? Jim, can you talk about that?
So I don't know that it's a quiet removal of enforcement. There was a famous memo that EPA's Office of Enforcement put out some weeks ago that I think was well covered in the press and the trade press, talking about non-enforcement by the federal government related to monitoring and reporting requirements. It's interesting to me that not only environmental groups, but also a group of states filed suit challenging that action, saying that will impair their own ability to enforce, even though that particular memo and policy doesn't itself apply to the states. I think that if there's an uncovered issue that I'd like to see attention paid to, it's the states themselves. Many states themselves have lost a lot of capacity during the pandemic to do inspection and enforcement and permit review. They're required to hold public hearings on all sorts of things, and they're having the same difficulties that the federal government is on to some degree. But I think the states are in worse shape in terms of their ability to maintain a level of attention and enforcement. So I think that's important on the enforcement side. On the deregulatory side, federally, I don't think anything has changed at all. It is full steam ahead as the administration attempts to finish everything by the end of May. And they want to finish by the end of May because the Congressional Review Act, if the Senate flips and the presidency flips, next January, there can be a 6-month reach back, roughly 6-month reach back to undo regulations. And so I think the deregulatory effort has not slowed down at all federally.
So, but you sort of got at the next question I was going to ask, which was, I'm a little fuzzy on state authority to. So on much environmental regulation, the feds pass on the enforcement abilities to the states, and I don't know if the feds saying we're not going to enforce this means the states have to pay attention to them. But what I also think I hear you saying is even if the states wanted to ignore them, they're so overwhelmed with resource needs for the pandemic that they can't do anything because they don't have the capacity.
That's it.
Okay, but I want to be clear on this point for the future. So even if the Fed said we're not going to enforce this stuff, do the states still have the ability, since enforcement is, I forget the technical term, but enforcement is turned over to states in many of these areas, do the states have the ability to say, no, we're going to keep enforcing it?
In almost every federal program, states have received authorization or delegation and maintain their own permitting and enforcement responsibility. There are exceptions, and there's patchwork in Indian country or states that haven't taken parts of particular programs. But the basic take home is, states are the frontline enforcers, permitters, receivers of monitoring information. So if the feds walk away, that's a bad thing because we don't have accountability or the backstop. But if the states are up to it and have the financing and the staff and the motor vehicles and the capacity, they can do it. But the states are in a world of hurt right now.
But when the environmental labs are running COVID tests instead of water quality tests, which is of concern. So that sort of reduces capacity to do anything.
Yeah, I would add on the capacity side too, the NGOs are all, everybody's locked down, and that doesn't mean they're not working, but it does stretch, but I think NGO budgets are going to be very challenged with the pandemic, and a lot of citizen enforcement has been very, very crucial to the implementation and enforcement of environmental law. Massachusetts versus EPA, which established that the Clean Air Act applies to greenhouse gas emissions, would not have occurred but for citizen groups. And so I think it's also important to think about the effects of the pandemic on those groups. I just wanted to say one other thing about how to think about the pandemic frame and environmental regulation that joins, I think, a couple of points people were making, and that is that the New York Times ran a story with a number of anonymous sources from EPA saying that they were being heavily pressured to issue rules in order to roll back or to get into place various much less stringent environmental regulation in order to avoid the Congressional Review Act that Jim just explained. At the same time that EPA is issuing this enforcement letter to companies saying, we understand that the pandemic is putting you in this terrible position and all your employees are working at home, and we're going to cut you a lot of slack. And so the juxtaposition of those two, to me, completely encapsulates the overall theoretical kind of or political approach to the environment under the Trump administration. Go full bore during the pandemic to roll back regulations, ease up on enforcement at the same time, because after all, that's really who we're trying to protect.
Similarly, and just what you're saying, it has me thinking about the stimulus and the Federal Reserve's actions, and the reported. It was reported recently. I haven't been following the real details in there, but this is an area I think that there's probably a lot of worthwhile investigative reporting to be done, and just reporting to be done in terms of really unpacking where that money is going and who's getting it. And I saw recently that ProPublica and a number of other organizations have filed some Freedom of Information Act lawsuits in order to actually get to some of that information. But it's been reported, and I think it's quite likely that the fossil fuel industry stands to gain, and that there's been lobbying in favor of bailing out oil and gas companies. At the same time, FERC in December passed the minimum offer price rule, which it affirmed more recently in March, which seeks to set a higher minimum price on renewables that receive state subsidies when they enter the grid. With the underlying theory being that state subsidies should not tilt the market. So on the one hand, you have the Republican-appointed majority on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission seeking to right the market by tamping down state subsidies in favor of renewables, while on the other hand, you have congressional money, bailout money, stimulus money, all going to subsidize the fossil fuel industry. Another fundamental inconsistency that's right there.
Are any of those issues, the funding, are there state level, county level, so that local reporters also can get a piece of this? Is there some way that they can, what can they look at in that regard that would be of value to them as they do their reporting?
It's a great question. I mean, my first thought on that is that much of this money is going to flow through the states. So tracking how the money flows through the states would be one reporting job. The other is that the minimum offer price rule does focus on state subsidies for new entrants into the wholesale capacity market. Ostensibly, that would include new fossil fuel entrants as well, and so there are plenty of state subsidies that are in place for the fossil fuel industry, including new actors that may be seeking to enter the market. So that may be another place to look on this.
Okay, so I want to remind you of the onlinequestions.org. We'll be taking questions in just a bit, but I want to bring in Emily Gertz. Emily, as I mentioned, is a board member of SCJ. She's also senior editor at the online publication Drilled News, and also a good friend, Emily. So if you're with us, if you have some questions that you'd like to throw in here as well, I'd appreciate that.
Great. Hi, Dale. Hello, everyone. Thank you for this really great presentation. I feel like the last 3.5 years of my reporting life have just gone past my eyes, and right up to the minute where, like, for instance, with this FERC move on renewable energy, this move to sort of undercut state subsidies of renewable energy is just one of the most recent things we added to our COVID-19 and climate policy rollback tracker at Drilled News. So that said, being someone who's covered policy on and off for a long time now, one of the things that a nut I have not been able to crack as a reporter is how to get audiences, my audiences, more interested in policy because of the ramifications it has for, the quality of our everyday life in America. When people are polled nationwide on these laws, they're uniformly supported by the public. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, national monuments. But the Trump administration is successfully undercutting all of them. So I wanted to start by asking, where do you folks, coming at it from your perspective, essentially as sources for reporters like myself, do you perceive any particular points of disconnect between how we reporters cover this and how the public acts or reacts to these situations? I'll start with you, Michael, because I've interviewed you before, and I think this is actually the first time we're seeing each other face to face. So, yeah, greetings.
Greetings. It's nice to see you. I mean, I think Jim and Ann will have a lot to say on this as well. But I guess I have a multiple responses. First, what's happening in the Trump administration and what they're moving forward with is not supported by the majority of the American public. And that, I don't think, has much to do with the way in which these stories are being reported. It has to do with an exertion of power, just sort of brute power. So I think that may be one frame. That's one narrative that I haven't seen reported a whole lot, which is that what this administration is doing is fundamentally at odds with what the majority of American people support and want, and yet they are doing it and getting away with it. We'll see exactly how much of it they do get away with. There's a lot about the courts that we haven't fully unpacked here that I think is worth exploring further. And that brings me to the second part of it, which is that in terms of the courts and environmental litigation and writing about environmental litigation in these cases, the Clean Power Plan or the ACE rule, the Clean Cars issues, MOPR, it's all very technical. It's all very wonky. As soon as you drill down beyond the headline or the lead paragraph, you're going to be into some pretty difficult area for a lot of readers, right? Difficult areas to hold the attention of a lot of readers. One of the things that Ann touched on earlier about the court cases that I think is very interesting and worthwhile is at the top level, what the courts are looking at when they're asked to review a regulation and whether the regulation is legal is whether the administration has offered a rational basis. Basically, whether what they're doing is arbitrary, capricious, contrary to law. These are ideas that I think everybody gets. And this administration is doing things that are patently unreasonable, that are contrary to the facts that are right in front of their faces, that are directly in contradiction to the congressional mandate that they're operating under. And this is, I think, a key component of the court cases that is maybe a little bit difficult to unpack, but is nonetheless there because it's difficult to unpack because it's in legalese, right? It's in these sort of judicial standards of review and so forth. But what's really at stake here is whether what these agencies are doing holds water. And I think we'll see when we do get to the substantive outcomes of some of these cases that it just doesn't. It's just unreasonable. It's just not supported by science, fact, or social science in any way.
Mm. So, Anne, like, how do you see that playing out in the next few years? And do the scenarios differ a great deal depending on who wins the White House and or the Senate this year?
Sure. Can I go back and just add a little bit to your first question, though? Because
please do.
I do have slightly. I do have my own take, which is just an observation from serving as a source to a lot of journalists over the years, that the case that has captured the public imagination more than any other case over the past 10 years, in my view, is the Giuliana litigation. And I think the reason for that is because they're beautiful children with real stories in the case. And so I just thought, so this is, in response to Dale's question about the stories that are, I think, underreported. If you go down the New York Times list of rules that have been either rolled back or being threatened to roll back, there are a number that deal with worker safety, with human safety, that don't get very much attention. So, for example, the Trump administration has rolled back rules that protect worker safety, rules that were adopted for chemical plants after the big West Texas chemical explosion. The Obama administration adopted those. It killed 15 people. It got a ton of national news. And then we see this being rolled back. Same thing with some of the Deepwater Horizon stuff. And so coal ash rules, pesticide rollbacks that affect real people on the ground. And so to the degree that the stories, I think, can tie to people who are actually going to receive less protection, I think, there's more natural kind of attraction to that. I'm not a reporter, but it's just the Giuliana thing has struck me because as law professors, so many of us thought it was a case that was never going to go anywhere. And yet we repeatedly got asked about it, including I got asked about it all the time by friends. 60 Minutes is reported on it. And so there are these rules that are really, really make a huge difference to people's individual lives, and they don't get much attention. We tend to see a lot of stories on the Clean Power Plan. Not that that doesn't have, dramatic effects on people, but there are some underreported stories, I think. So the basic question that you asked is, what happens? Does everything change if there's a new president? And the answer is yes. I mean, this is many people have said this about this election. It's the most consequential election of our lifetimes on many issues. The environment is clearly one of them. And climate change is the most obvious example of that. We have an administration that either denies the existence of climate change or acknowledges it in various places in federal agencies, but is rolling back or putting into place rules that don't do anything to actually resolve the problem or to attack the problem, including things like something that Michael mentioned earlier, which I think is another kind of human impact story. Rolling back rules to consider the effects of climate change and sea level rise on flooding infrastructure. I mean, if we have big, massive floods and the infrastructure hasn't taken that into account, that's really, really consequential. So we have these very sort of wonky technical things that have real human impact. But yes, it matters a lot, but I think the courts are also really worth focusing on here. I think it's safe to say, and Jim and Michael, you might differ with me here, although I suspect you might not, that the attempt to use the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases aggressively is going to be very tough to sustain with this Supreme Court. The switch, having Anthony Kennedy step down and replaced by Kavanaugh fundamentally alters the balance of environmental power on the court, I think. We don't know fully yet because most of the cases haven't yet reached the high court, but Kavanaugh was very clear when he was a DC Circuit judge that he does not like using the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases. That is the basis for most of the aggressive climate policies that the Obama administration adopted because couldn't get through anything through Congress. And so what happens in Congress is going to matter a lot too, because I don't think the next president is going to be able to expansively use executive power to regulate climate change and have it upheld by the Supreme Court. So the election is not just about the president, it's also about the Senate and the House. And I think that will make a huge difference in what happens in terms of environmental policy.
So just a quick follow-up before I give Jim a crack at the questions. You know, you mentioned Kavanaugh. I was really struck during Neil Gorsuch's passage onto the court how little attention was paid to his parentage as the son of Anne Gorsuch Burford, and someone who apparently came out just about as traumatized as she did from her the debacle of her EPA leadership under Reagan, which just in brief, if anyone isn't aware, Reagan brought her in to essentially dismantle EPA. The blowback was very intense. She was, and she also, I believe, was brought up on some ethics complaints. And okay. And, you know, she left in fairly short order, and Reagan actually had to bring in William Ruckelshaus to rebuild the place, you know, completely contrary to everything he had, his whole ethos. So, and apparently that made a huge impression on her son, who is now a Supreme Court justice, just as some of these cases are likely to percolate their way up. Is there any idea of what his take is on any of these issues, either, and how much his personal history influences his legal philosophy?
So he was on the 10th Circuit, not the DC Circuit, and so he did not hear a lot of environmental cases. He did uphold actually Colorado's some renewable energy laws, but we know that he has serious misgivings about the Chevron doctrine, which has to do with delegation of authority to administrative agencies, and EPA is going to be right in the middle of all of that. He has been so consistently conservative that I would imagine that, you know, on most environmental cases, he will be joining Alito and Thomas on the, you know, the most conservative wing. Kavanaugh seems to sometimes indicate that he is going to side with Roberts a little bit more. You know, if you wanted to divide the conservative wing into two different groups, I think Roberts and Kavanaugh, at least on some issues, are likely to be slightly less conservative. I don't know much about his, you know, whether his mother's experience at EPA. I mean, I'm sure he heard about it a lot as a child. It had to have been formative and traumatic. He's in his 50s, and so he must have been a teenager when all of this was going on, or maybe a slightly younger. You know, but he grew up in a world of you know, anti-EPA, anti-environmental protection rhetoric, I imagine, in his household, and he, you know, he has proven to be actually even more conservative than I thought he was going to be when he was nominated. But one of the reasons I think there was less attention paid to the environment is because in his role on the 10th Circuit, he just didn't have much of a record, whereas Kavanaugh on the DC Circuit had ruled and in fact had written a number of opinions, particularly on the Clean Air Act and its stretch. And so we had a much clearer view of what his judicial philosophy was going to be on environmental cases.
Okay. And so, Jim, like, are there any arenas where you feel that reporters are missing opportunities to bring these policy rollback stories home to their audiences?
So there are some areas that I think are important, and my theory is that these environmental wonky stories do need to be brought home or into very practical or homely kinds of examples. And there are at least two that I think are worth paying attention to. One is the big proposed rollback of the NEPA regulations, which is a set of regulations that have existed since 1978. They were actually adopted by consensus. The Chamber of Commerce supported them. All the environmental organizations supported them. No one sued. Who could believe this? And we've used these regulations across the federal government for every federal permit or leasing program or infrastructure activity. And so when people think of environmental impact statements or alternatives, they think of the regulations, not the statute. And the rewrite that was proposed in January completely tears these up and says, you're not going to look at cumulative impacts anymore. We're not going to look at indirect impacts anymore. Agencies will only look at alternatives that they themselves have control over. They're not going to look at other alternatives. So it's a wholesale replacement or tearing up of this regime that we've operated under for at least the last 40 years. And there was a lot of coverage when the proposed rules came out, but it was all focused on climate, that this will affect or make it hard to consider climate in doing a coal lease or an oil and gas pipeline. But in fact, this will affect every little stream crossing, every wetlands permit. It'll have a profound impact on environmental justice. Our whole environmental justice regime is built on, is there a disproportionate high and adverse impact on a minority or low-income community? And these rules, the NEPA rules, tear up any consideration of cumulative impacts. So I think paying attention to, what are the close to home examples of what if these rules are adopted the way they are, not just on climate, which is amazingly important, but on local impacts on communities. The same occurs on things like the pending change, which was rumored to come out today and may still, under the Clean Water Act. EPA has proposed to rewrite rules that were adopted back in 1972 on the state's role in conditioning federal permits. And EPA has taken the view that the Supreme Court got it wrong in 1994, and they're proposing to take advantage of a version of the Chevron doctrine called the Brand X doctrine, great name for the doctrine, but under Brand X, EPA has said, we're not going to allow states to look at in-stream flows. We're not going to allow them to look at fisheries. We're not going to allow them to look at forests along stream beds, stream banks, because the Supreme Court got it wrong in 1994, and our new rule is going to have this effect. So I think bringing these kind of big arcane things down to how does this affect all the close to home stuff, the boat landings or the compressor stations in a minority neighborhood, is the way to go.
And I think it's worth noting, for instance, that change you just mentioned, that's the mechanism by which some states, I believe, including mine, New York, have blocked permitting of pipelines recently, right?
And that's right, and that's why the administration attacked it. But in attacking it, in order to make the world safer for pipelines and to stick it to the New York regulators, in fact, they have taken away or about to take away all the kinds of things states do all the time on imposing sediment and erosion controls on electric power lines that cross waterways, or very, very ordinary homely examples with dealing with boat ramps and the like. So in effect, by trying to kill off an obstacle that New York and some other states applied, in effect, there are all these unintended consequences. And that, to me, is something that at least local reporters might be able to do a pretty nice job on.
By the way, completely inconsistent with the Trump administration and the EPA's vow to delegate power to the states, right? Or to return power locally. I know that's everybody's inconsistent about federalism, but this administration really hates federalism when it protects the environment. And I think it's important to note that.
All right, Emily, I'm going to jump in now
Okay.
because
Thank you all.
we're ready for questions. Emily, thank you so much. We have a lot of questions, and I'd like to get to those before our time is up at the bottom of the hour. And please, I would encourage all the journalists to stick with this because I have important information about where you can find all this data. Someone has asked for some links, and we'll put that up on the blog as well. So we'll talk about that at the end. I want to address one question quickly because they say that they're struck with the mild language we're using about the administration's misdeeds, and in your favor, they say "and's a bit gloves off." So, I want to point out that this is a webinar that's co-sponsored with the Society of Environmental Journalists. There are many different views in the journalism community about activism, about other things, and SEJ's role, and Emily, you can explain this if I mess this up, but the role is to be as down the middle as possible, as fair to all sides as possible, to not present any sort of bias. So we've been very cautious in the way that we've approached this, and that's why I said at the top that this was not a debate. This was simply a discussion about the issues.
Well, let me interject there since you've invoked SEJ and I'm a member of the SEJ board. I feel pretty confident in saying that SEJ's overall position is that journalists should have editorial independence and be able to report accurately and factually without interference that might affect that. I don't know that fair or balanced necessarily appear in our position on how journalism should be conducted. I think we're in favor of truth.
Absolutely.
And then yes, but definitely within SEJ's membership and leadership, there's a lot of differing opinions about how to do that even now.
So simply, we're just trying to be as even-handed as possible.
Can I say a word about gloves off? So I struggle with this. I just want to say, and I imagine that that Jim and Michael do too. I have traditionally viewed my role as being sort of a neutral talking head expert type. And I've found it increasingly hard with this administration. And so my gloves have come off a bit. I will say just the one thing that illustrates this best for me is if the administration won't acknowledge the greatest environmental existential threat to humankind, it's very hard for me to then sit back and be neutral about it. And I do kind of try, and I worry sometimes that I go over the edge. But I try to be truthful at least.
Well, and the other part of the question is, don't you think that we need to use more forceful language when discussing maybe existential regulatory rollbacks? My personal belief is, yes, we do. That facts weigh out. That as journalists, we represent the facts and the truth, and it's important when the facts say that these are problems that we say these are problems. But nonetheless, I wanted just to get that through that quickly. We've got several questions though about what came up at the end of Emily's conversation there, and that is the issue of the judiciary. So I'll read a couple of them, and we can sort of combine them and if I could get all three of your responses. One says, I'd love to get into the legal changes since COVID-19 and effects on the ground of those rollbacks. The administration has ordered a stop to enforcement of many of its environmental and health protections. So that's not sorry, let me find the, well, this is tangential, but similar. Can someone speak to the issue of how the Trump administration has been remaking scientific advisory boards and the impact this has had on policymaking? And you spoke about that near the top, but we didn't really talk much about the impact it's had on policymaking. So could you guys address that briefly?
Sure. So there's actually a sort of positive example of the attempt by EPA to stack some of these scientific advisory boards that these boards can actually have a lot of effect on the policies that EPA actually has to adopt. So for example, when it sets national ambient air quality standards, it has to review them every 5 years, and it has to set them based on the best available science, and it collects a bunch of scientists together to advise it about that. And if it goes against that science, it can get overturned in court. So one thing that's been interesting is as EPA has removed some scientists, including those who get grants from EPA, they've been now I think a court has stepped in to prevent them from doing that. They've replaced them, but a number of the people with whom they've replaced them have actually turned out to be more independent-minded than I think EPA had in mind. So they, for example, have criticized very heavily the basis on which EPA rolled back the car standards for greenhouse gases. And so one really interesting legal question is going to be, what happens when even EPA's own, appointed boards that are self-selected by the EPA administrator himself are contradicting the moves that the administration is making? The same thing happened with the so-called WOTUS rule, the Waters of the United States, that's the Wetlands Protection Rules. So they haven't entirely succeeded in their efforts to sort of stack the scientific advisory boards with people who will toe a particular party line. And I think that is an interesting story in and of itself. And then there's been some similar sorts of things that have gone on with some agency scientists who have, I think, again, in the car rules, there's some stuff that got inserted into the administrative record that I think is going to hurt the administration. It's going to make it harder for them to win in court, because those kind of, those folks who on the ground actually know what's going on have been fairly sophisticated about how to build, how to potentially undermine the administrative record that is rolling back rules that really don't have a basis in either economics or science. So I'll stop there.
I will say there are moves that may have a longer term impact on science rollback. EPA got rid of some of its science advisory board adjuncts, essentially. They've changed the ability of the SAB to set its own agenda or decide what it is going to review. So the ability to call on those kinds of reviews or to look at those may be limited. The NEPA rule that I keep harping on that's proposed says agencies don't need to do any new science when they're considering a federal permit or federal action. And in fact, there are instances where we really do need to do science to understand the impacts. But if the rule's adopted, they're essentially going to say, no, we don't need to do science, use whatever you have.
So if I could just add in as well, I think first on the science advisory committees, I actually worked on the lawsuit that Anne mentioned, where the policy that Scott Pruitt had put into place banning scientists with agency grants from serving on the agency's science advisory committees was overturned by the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. And this is one of those instances where the agency, it just failed to explain why it was doing what it was doing. It failed to acknowledge that there was an existing policy in place that not only allowed these scientists to serve on the committees, but in fact encouraged them, because oftentimes these are some of the leading scientists in the narrow fields that EPA is going to be regulating in. And so they want these leading academic university-based scientists to serve on the committees, not to ban them from doing so. And so it's an perfect example of what I think we'll see more of, which is a court stepping in and saying the agency failed to acknowledge that it's reversing an existing policy and failed to provide any rational basis for the decision that it did make. And that sort of brings me to a response in part, and to your comments, which was, I think that in thinking about these sorts of the role of the judiciary in reviewing agency regulations, there's this presumption that we all had, maybe some of us still have it, that the agency is regulating in good faith. That is, that it's making an actual policy choice that it believes is the appropriate way to negotiate the competing interests of the various stakeholders involved, the public interest, industry and economic interests, the government agencies themselves in terms of administrative efficiency and manageability, most vulnerable populations, all of the other stakeholders, states, cities, tribes, all of the stakeholders. The agency's role is to mediate these interests and come up with a policy that still effectuates congressional intent and achieves the ultimate goal. But what if the administration is not pursuing that fundamental goal? And so it goes ahead and promulgates rules that lack any scientific basis, as with the car rule, right? Where there are just these glaring holes that are exactly the sort of thing. And it's worth, for the journalists on this webinar who aren't totally familiar with this, it takes a lot for a court to overturn an agency action in many of these cases, whether it's an environmental impact statement or a regulation. The agency kind of has to go pretty far afield in most instances in order to get overturned. And oftentimes it's something like they just ignored basic facts. They clearly rigged the numbers. That's what we're seeing now, and that's what we're going to continue to see. So I think it's safe at this point to do away with the notion that this administration is pursuing regulation in good faith in order to achieve some desirable goal, and instead is pursuing regulation in essence to undo regulation altogether.
The only thing I would add here, though, is that we haven't heard from too many Trump-appointed judges on a lot of these, and so the influence of the judicial appointments, I think, has yet to be fully felt. And once it is, we could see court opinions that absolutely rubber stamp the bad faith. And I just think we don't know that yet. And we certainly don't know yet at the US Supreme Court level. Not all these cases are going to get up to the Supreme Court, but those that do, I suspect we're going to see a whole lot more deference to the administration than we've seen in some of the lower court cases.
And you're not talking about political bias, you're talking about deferential to another branch of government.
Well, deference cuts in all sorts of different ways, just as federalism does, right? So, on the one hand, we see the Supreme Court not necessarily wanting to defer to Congress in certain instances. But I think on the administrative agency question, there's been a lot of kind of writing around the idea that the U.S. Supreme Court is not likely to defer to agencies as significantly as it has in the past. This is under this Chevron doctrine. But I suspect that when we see some of these Trump administration interpretations, particularly of the Clean Air Act, particularly with respect to climate change, the court is going to defer. It's going to say this is a narrow interpretation of the statute. We can go, this is a really complicated area, and I don't want to spend all the time talking about it, but I think it's not a stretch to predict that the Trump administration's efforts to roll back a lot of the climate policies in particular are going to be upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court if they get up there. I don't know about the California waiver. I think that's a more complex question. But I think certainly on the Clean Power Plan and its replacement rule, I think we're likely to see the court upholding what the Trump administration is doing.
That's great. It's like deference it's a one-way ratchet with deference potentially, right? Where no deference for more stringent regulation, but plenty of deference if the interpretation is to allow less regulation.
Jim, you're laughing.
Might be right.
Okay. So we're getting close to the rapid fire rounds here, but one that sort of flows from the judiciary to the advisory panels. A lot of environmental professionals have left or been forced out of state and federal jobs. Do you have any idea where this capacity is gone? Can they be re-engaged, or what is the penalty to be paid in years in time to rebuild that capacity?
The only little thing that I would say, because I feel like the folks in Washington, Jim, may have a better answer to this, but California's hired a lot of them, so that's been good news. We've got a lot of good EPA talent coming west.
Michael or Jim?
I actually am not sure. I think a lot of it's going to depend on whether there's an opportunity to backfill or staff up, because there has been a brain drain at the federal agencies, and there has not been the hiring at the entry levels and people applying at the entry levels. I mean, there haven't been, at least as I hear it, as many applications as, certain folks don't find it as attractive to work for some of the federal agencies at this point. So I guess the question is, what will the economics permit going forward? And if the Trump administration is reelected or reinstalled, will they decide that it's worth staffing up in order to pursue their agendas? Right now, there's been sort of a continued hollowing out, and they're actings, the heads of agencies. We've had no Park Service or Bureau of Land Management director for the entire administration, but they're actings below that. And at the staff level, people are 55, they're headed out. So I think there's going to either be a rebuilding if there's a change in administration, or we'll have to see whether a re-elected administration feels that in order to do anything, they're going to try to get by with a skeleton crew, which is what they're doing right now.
I would just add.
Oop, just froze on us, Ann.
Go ahead.
Anna, you still there?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, now you're back.
Okay, sorry. I was just going to say that I do think that I'm getting a message saying my internet connection is unstable. So hopefully I'll stick with you. That the pandemic economic fallout for states is going to be really obviously incredibly dramatic. And if the feds don't step in with a big stimulus package for states, we're going to see environmental budgets at the state level and the local level absolutely devastated. I think that's just a huge issue to watch out for, because that's going to be some of the first stuff that's cut, I suspect.
Yeah, we're already seeing that in some of the states.
So I want to write a quick note on that. You're right, that's an important one to be tracking here. I always take those unstable things when they flash up on the screen very personally. I feel like they're challenging me on that. Let's bring this a little more local. One of the other questions, so many of these actions happen under the public's radar. People don't really feel the effects in any immediate sense. Any advice for how to get across to readers or viewers or listeners that these changes affect their health and lives? And this is kind of the money question. We've talked about a lot of political, a lot of technical stuff here, but it really comes down to people, right? So how do we, I guess the question is, how can we get this across that these things affect people?
So I'll push back a little bit against this again, because I think that environmental support has long been very broad and very shallow, right? That's the sort of way that it's thought about. And the activities that are, so I guess that the assumption is that the stories aren't registering and people aren't really getting the information, or they're not responding as fulsomely as they might. But I think that there's a lot of support. I think that the students that I work with and kids that are in my kids' classes and all the rest, there's a lot of awareness of the extent of environmental and climate crisis. And there's a broad social movement that's mobilizing around that, and the stories that are written are a big part of that. The constant flow of information is a big part of that. I do think that, obviously characters matter, making it personal matters, keeping it local matters. The more you scale up, the further up you go towards the UNFCCC, the more abstract and less tangible the issues become. But at the same time, people also, I think, feel a little exhausted by all of this, the many stories of individuals who have been adversely impacted by one disaster or another, one climate-related disaster or another. So I think that, the stories, there's so much going on in this. There are conspiracies of the fossil fuel industry. There's a out-of-control administration that's running amok over our country and its values. There are state and local leaders that are stepping up to sort of seize the day and demonstrate real leadership and try and achieve real action, even in the midst of a global pandemic where everything is stressed and everybody is stressed. So I think that the stories are there, and there's a great deal of coverage of it. Whether a sustainable future and an optimistic gloss is more likely to register with people than an apocalyptic vision or a doomsday scenario, whether somebody's more likely to respond to an epidemiological study showing that kids are, at severe risk of disease 20 years down the line, or more likely to respond to the story of some kid that they don't know on the other side of town who has asthma. I don't think that there's any clear answer to any of those questions. I've read a lot of the climate communications and environmental communications literature on this, and there doesn't seem to me to be a clear answer about what stories register with anyone. So I think of it and the work that you all are doing as kind of, the bodhisattva of 1,000 hands. It's going to take a different angle to reach the many, many individuals who are out there responding to this information.
So
Yeah, Jim.
one thing that registers a lot is telling the story, and the reaction you get is, well, that's just dumb. Why is that? Why are we rolling back methane regulation that plenty of companies say they're willing to comply with, or the like? So that's one approach, but I think it's insufficient, because it also then leads to general distrust of governments being able to do anything. So I'm wondering if there is a way to tell a story that there is a way to do this stuff right and well, and that we're smart enough to do things right and well, and there are plenty of students coming out of our universities, and there are plenty of people that are able to do this, and it's just a question of giving them the tools to do that. So it's not just why are they doing that? That's dumb. What do you expect? Government's dead loss, but it's this may be dumb, but there's a smart way to do it, and having some of these explainers as to what is the smart way to do it, with some up and coming folks that are saying, yeah, we could do that.
I think it's important also, and Michael, you touched on this, it is important to tell stories about people. And I would argue for a lot of the people who are participating in this, that one of the best entry points is in what I think is one of the most undercovered areas, and that is the economically challenged people of color. These are the communities that are most affected by so many of these things. These are the people that live next door to the power plants. These are the people who are being bombarded by PM 2.5. We have not seen a huge amount of that coverage in the pandemic. During the pandemic, we're hearing about how minority communities, especially people of color, are the ones who are being who are dying at the highest percentages, the highest rates. And people seem to be, at least up here in the North Country, they kind of shrug their shoulders and say, well, yeah, they have all these pre-existing conditions. But the link between their pre-existing conditions and how they live, that they're living in these communities where this PM 2.5 is compromising their lungs, which makes them more susceptible to asthma and to COVID-19 by chance. So these are stories that I think that are ripe for the picking, and that go to our responsibility as journalists to find voice for the voiceless. And I think I always return to that these are great entry points for these stories too. So I hope that you'll consider those as opportunities, especially when it comes to environmental stories, because that so often happens. And the other thing is sort of one of you got at the idea of strange bedfellows, and there are hunters groups that are huge rabid environmentalists, because it affects their ability to hunt, their ability to fish, their ability to do backpack, to do all these things. And so it'd be interesting to see their perspectives and how they view some of these environmental rollbacks too. There are many coalitions that you might not think of that are coming together to challenge a lot of these things. So let's, I'm sorry. Yep,
I was just going to add one thing, which is that one of the things that I've been really impressed with, this is not advice to journalists, it's praise for journalists, is the extent of environmental coverage these days is pretty phenomenal, and it's way different than it was 10 years ago. Mike and I spend an extraordinary amount of our time, I think, responding to press calls from, tiny news outlets to the biggest. And I would just want to applaud that. I know there are a lot of journalists on the phone, and I'm incredibly impressed also at the knowledge base a lot of environmental journalists are bringing to the stories that they're covering. And so that's a really, I think that's an indicator that the public is interested and there is a hunger for stories on the environment. Just how many environmental journalists, I know there's a rough time and people are getting cut, et cetera, but there are a lot of people covering stories, and I applaud that and appreciate it.
I appreciate your comment. The reality is it's still about 2% of news coverage is environmental coverage, and it hasn't budged too much. But
no, I get that, but it still feels different than it did 10 years ago. Maybe that's because some of the specialty sites like E&E News and Bloomberg Environment and so forth. But or maybe it's just because I'm old, so people call me more now. but it feels different to me than it used to be.
Good. That's good to hear. So let's bring this all home. What does this all mean? This whole conversation we've had for the last hour and a half. What's it mean for the new president, for the next president? Michael, you had such an impish little look there. I want to hear what you have to say.
I think that Jim and Ann were touching on this before with the new. I was Jim. I was a little concerned because you said if Trump is reelected or installed, and I was curious about that particular choice of word, but leaving that aside for the moment, assuming that for the purpose of staying positive for the rest of the day, assuming that there is a change of administration, in January 2021, I think it's going to be an all-out. We're going to be reversing course again. And all of those things that I said at the beginning of this, those various Clean Air Act, NEPA, public lands management, energy efficiency, all of the existing tools are going to need to be leveraged and put to work right away. And that's one of the things that we are seeing right now is that it takes time to get these regulations through, even in the best of circumstances, or even when you're cutting as many corners as you possibly can. And so it's going to be an all-out effort, and restaffing the agencies and bringing back the, all of the brain that has been drained. I expect that there are going to be a lot of people who want to do that because we're at a crisis, and a lot of people recognize that. And there's, people may come back from California to DC, or maybe everything will be happening virtually and they won't have to, and they can stay west and work in DC. But there will be a tremendous amount of effort to right the ship in another half year or so.
So I want to suggest that the pandemic and the economic consequences and fallout are both scary, obviously, and scary in terms of what that means for environmental protection, but also really do and have provided us with an opportunity to shift the conversation. And I think that conversation was already shifting. So Michael alluded to this with sort of enthusiasm among students, et cetera. I do think that there is a way that we are now talking about climate change that dramatically differs from even 2 or 3 years ago. The people feel it on the ground. They understand the existential threat that we face because we see it now in wildfires around the world and flooding, et cetera. And so I think that a new administration has an opportunity to make this not just a under the radar kind of wonky conversation, but instead to do it. I mean, Biden, I think appointing John Kerry and AOC to lead his sort of task force on climate seems to me to be the sort of perfect blend to take all those years of expertise and all the commitment that Kerry has shown, I think, to climate, and combine it with the youth and passion and energy that AOC really seems to capture. And so what I hope that a new president would do is to really capitalize on that and to use, for example, economic rebuilding in a way that invests in, this sounds really wonky, but invests in green infrastructure, that thinks hard about not putting dollars into highways, but instead into electric vehicle infrastructure or into renewable energy efficiency, rebuild, all the sorts of things that the Green New Deal suggests, maybe on a scale that the Green New Deal, probably, wanted to accomplish, it probably can't, but nevertheless provides us with a frame to think bigger and bolder in a way that I think is important. And I think Biden is edging in that direction, given who he's tapped to kind of lead this effort.
The first webinar I did when I started in this new role at Columbia in the midst of the pandemic was looking at the opportunity to rethink the economy. So return to normal or return to something new that is more equitable and fair. And I think the same argument can be made for the environment. This is an opportunity to reset and really rethink how we view the environment. Jim, last word on this?
I think restaffing will be really important if there's a change in administration. And I think we got to put a lot of chips on the states, regardless of whether there's a change in administration, because they've got huge challenges, but they also have a lot of opportunity.
And I will say that we're also working on a webinar that we hope to launch in a couple of weeks that will be looking at, and this goes back to a little bit of what Ann was saying, but the idea of overlapping crises, that things don't happen in isolation, that we have a pandemic, then we have a hurricane, then we have a wildfire, but how do you cover issues with overlapping risk and accumulated risk. So that's something we hope to have up in the next couple of weeks. So I hope you'll join us for that. But our time is done, and I want to thank our guests today, Michael Berger, Ann Carlson, and Jim McElfish, and of course, Emily Gertz for joining us. Hang on with some other quick information. My thanks to SEJ, Society of Environmental Journalists, for co-sponsoring this event. SEJ is my home, and if you're interested in environmental issues, it should be yours as well. Before you leave, some additional information. Please note we'll have a blog post that will contain more information and resources on this topic. I will have, in fact, we had a question about shareholder trackers, and we'll see if we can find that and include that as well. I'll have a lot of links and documents you'll want to go through. The post will be up in a day or two at the Earth Institute blog, State of the Planet, and the address for that is blogs, B-L-O-G-S, .ei.columbia.edu. That's blogs.ei.columbia.edu, and you'll also be able to watch the video of today's talk there. Also, be sure to check out Andy Revkin's initiative on communication and sustainability at the Earth Institute. That's where you can read more about my program once we get the web page up in a few weeks. And while there, please look at some of our other posts. We have links to resource pages for journalists, and many of them contain story ideas. It's a great site to mine for ways of covering the most significant stories of our time. Again, thank you from the North Country of New York, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye. Thanks for joining.